I want to tell you about the moment I stood up in the fellowship hall of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, with 63 of my neighbors seated in those metal folding chairs, the May evening light falling through the high, narrow windows in long, specific columns across the floor. Every face in that room turned toward me, and I pressed play on a small black speaker and let my daughter's own voice fill that space like a second sermon. Her voice came out of it bright and careless and warm, the voice of a woman entirely certain of her safety. My mother has no idea what she signed. She's old. She just wants things to feel normal. Picture 63 people going completely still. Picture Pastor Williams setting down his glass of sweet tea with slow, deliberate care. Picture my neighbor, Miss Eula, 3 rows back, closing her eyes. And picture my daughter, Renee, sitting across the room in her white blouse and her honey gold blazer, watching her own words come out of that small speaker with the specific horror of a person who has just understood, fully and with no exit available, the exact scope of what she underestimated. I was standing at the front of that room, 75 years old, in my Navy church dress, my church fan with Martin Luther King's face tucked under my left arm. My hands were not shaking. I was holding 41 audio recordings, a folder of bank statements with 63 copies made, one for every seat, and 6 years of documented evidence of everything that had been taken from me and everything I had done in response. I said, "My daughter spent my mother's $34,000 inheritance on a wedding she did not invite me to attend. She thought the woman who paid the deposit had forgotten what she signed." That is the end of this story. Now I need to take you back to the beginning, because the ending is only comprehensible if you understand what came before, and what came before looked nothing like what it became. If someone in your life is making you feel invisible in your own story, share this video with them right now, because what happened to me is far more common than anyone wants to say out loud, and knowing the warning signs is the only thing that changes how the story ends. It was spring in New Orleans, which in this city means the windows finally open and life starts to feel possible again, means the magnolias are out and the air off the river has that green, living smell to it, and on our urban block near the elevated train, the corner store had already put out crates of peaches on the sidewalk, and there were children on bikes in the street again. I had my kitchen window open that morning. I was looking out at the rain falling on the street, just a spring shower, the kind that moves through in 20 minutes and leaves the whole world clean. And my whole house smelled of the black-eyed peas cooking with a ham hock I had started well before noon. I was 75 years old. I was wearing my rust-colored cardigan with the wooden buttons that I have owned for 9 years and still reach for first on cool mornings. My church fan with Martin Luther King's face on it was sitting on the kitchen windowsill, where I place it every morning like a quiet act of faith. Not for the cooling, but because his face in the morning reminds me of something I tend to forget on difficult days, that dignity does not negotiate, and a woman who has survived enough is not so easily made to disappear. On my kitchen table, a half-finished quilt spread out in its squares. I quilt a blanket for each grandchild, always have. I was making this one for Renee's firstborn someday, red and yellow and a deep navy blue, with a border pattern my own mother taught me when I was 12. 3 weeks of evening work already in it. Something beautiful being made from my hands, at my table, in my house, for my family. I did not yet know that my family had spent 3 years quietly transferring that family's inheritance elsewhere. The rotary phone on my kitchen wall, the one my late husband Raymond mounted himself in 1991 with a level and a drill, and that particular Saturday patience of his, the one I have never once considered replacing because some things in a house belong to a person who is gone, and replacing them feels like an erasure, rang with its solid, certain sound, and I dried my hands and picked up the receiver. "Mom," Renee's voice, always confident. "I need to talk to you about the wedding." I had been waiting for this call. The wedding was in August. I had not received an invitation. I had been finding reasonable explanations for the absence of my name on the guest list. I had been telling myself my daughter loved me. "We've been talking," she said, "and we think it's better if you don't come." You'd make everything awkward. You don't fit the aesthetic. 11 words. I stood in my kitchen with the rain just ending outside my window, and the black-eyed peas still cooking and the half-finished quilt on my table, the one I had been making for her future child, and I held the phone in both hands and said nothing for a very long time. I set the receiver back in its cradle. I looked at my church fan on the windowsill. Outside, the street was gleaming and clean, and somewhere on the block a child was laughing at something joyful. I should have wept. Instead, something went very quiet inside me. Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of a decision being made below the level of words. What I didn't know yet was that my daughter had not only uninvited me from her $99,000 wedding, she had used my own mother's savings to pay the deposit, the inheritance, my mother's entire small fortune, 50 years of careful building from a cleaning job that paid almost nothing and a dignity that paid her everything, used to fund a celebration I was told I did not fit the aesthetic of. She believed I was too old, too tired, and too trusting to ever find out. She was wrong on all 3 counts. Here is what I need you to understand about Renee before I tell you what she did. I do not believe she was always this person. Or perhaps she was, and I refuse to see it clearly, because seeing it clearly would have meant admitting that 42 years of devotion had been received as something closer to a profit opportunity than a gift. I raised her alone after Raymond died. He passed when she was 9, bad heart, quick at the end though we had a warning year. And there was no real life insurance, no accumulated wealth to sustain us. Nothing but this modest ranch house with its chain-link fence that my own mother had paid for over 30 years of cleaning other people's floors, and my income from the hospital, and a determination that Renee would never feel her father's absence in any material way. I worked double shifts at Tulane Medical Center for 11 years. I sent her to a good school. I never told her how close to the edge we ran, because children should not carry that weight. I believed in reciprocity the way some people believe in gravity, as the operating principle of everything. I believed my sacrifices were an investment, that love compounds like interest, that the more you pour into a family, the more waits for you when you finally need to make a withdrawal. I held this belief for 40 years. It is the most expensive thing I have ever owned, and the cost of it runs to considerably more than $34,000 when you count the other currencies. What I gave up for it was my dignity, inch by inch, year by year, in 100 small erasures I named as something other than what they were. She began calling me difficult before she turned 30. Not to my face. Renee was too polished for that. But at church events, family gatherings, in front of her friends. Said it lightly, with a self-deprecating laugh, like I was a charming inconvenience in her otherwise well-organized life. My mother is a lot. People smiled. I smiled. I told myself the love was just temporarily outpacing its expression. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because I think you have heard someone described as a lot, and I think you have seen the face of the person being talked about. And you know the thing that face is working hard not to show. She introduced me at our church dinners, the ones I cooked alone for 20 years, every dish, the stuffed merlotins and the bread pudding, and the red beans I started Thursday, so they'd be right for Sunday, as her difficult mother. She redirected conversations when I spoke and called it moving things along. She asked me not to call during work hours, not to visit unannounced, not to make things heavy when she was already stressed. I gave her all of it. I accepted every reduction because I believed the debt of love I was building required my patience as collateral. The quilting went quiet. I say this because it costs me something to say it, not for the lost hours, but for what the hours represented. The quilting was the one time I stopped giving and just was, when my hands did what they knew and my mind got to be still. After Raymond died, I quilted every night after Renee went to sleep. I made quilts for her dorm room, her apartments, all the places she took herself. But somewhere in the years of cooking lighter and calling less often so I wouldn't be a bother, the quilting went quiet too. I cooked for her preferences at my own stove. I adjusted my appetite, for food, for visits, for my own voice, to accommodate her comfort. I stopped being the person who lived in this house and became the person whose house was a resource for someone else's life. But every morning my church fan was on the windowsill. Every morning, Martin Luther King's face looked out at me. Steady. The signs came early. A bank statement I didn't recognize that she explained away. A routine transfer, administrative, handled. My neighbor, Miss Eula, asking me once, carefully, with a particular expression on her face, whether I'd noticed anything unusual in my accounts lately. I told her firmly that Renee was helping manage things. Miss Eula's face did something complicated when I said that, and I stored that expression away without opening it again, because opening it would have required acknowledging what I was not yet ready to know. Something was wrong. I felt it the way you feel weather before the sky changes color. But I looked at the half-finished quilt on my table and I thought, when the grandchild arrives, she will look at this quilt and she will understand everything I built for her, and she will know what she owes. Some things can only be understood after you stop looking away and start counting. March 14th, 2024. 11:18 p.m. I know the exact time because it is on my hospital discharge papers, which I have read many times since that night. I was standing at my stove, something small, some late pot on a night when I had been eating irregularly and sleeping poorly, moving through my days under a weight I called age, but which was actually a grief that had not yet been named. I had begun, in the back of some part of myself I wasn't fully listening to know that something was very wrong. But I had not yet allowed the knowing to come fully into the light. I felt the kitchen tilt. My hands went wrong. I was on the floor near the stove before I understood that I was falling. The paramedics found me. 9 days in the hospital. Hypertensive event, the doctors said. Blood pressure at a number they shared with each other quietly, in the way medical people communicate when they don't want to alarm you and are alarmed. I was stable. I would be fine. But when a 75-year-old woman collapses alone in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night with no one to call and no one who comes, the hospital assigns a social worker. Her name was Ms. Patricia Thureau. Small, efficient, reading glasses on a beaded chain. A completely direct way of looking at you that made the performance of fine feel impossible. She came to my house the day after I was discharged and sat at my kitchen table with a notepad and asked about my living situation, my finances, my support network, in a tone so matter-of-fact that honesty was simply the easiest available response. I told her my daughter had medical power of attorney. She wrote something without comment. Then, still not looking up from her notepad, Mrs. Boudreau, would you be willing to pull 6 years of bank statements so we can look at them together? I pulled them together. She sat with me for 4 hours. I want to tell you what I found, because I need you to understand the full net worth of what had been taken. Not abstractly, but in the exact figures of my mother's life. The $34,000 savings account, gone. My mother's small fortune. 50 years of careful building from a cleaning job that paid almost nothing, and a dignity that paid everything. Withdrawn in increments over 22 months through accounts Renee had accessed through paperwork I signed in a hospital waiting room in 2021, without my glasses, trusting the person I trusted most in the world. My mother's silver and her gold brooch and the pearl earrings that had passed through 4 generations of women in my family, sold. The sale receipts sat at the bottom of a cardboard box Renee had labeled Mom's medical records and placed in a storage unit she had been organizing on my behalf. A lien on my house, my mother's house, left to me free and clear. The house paid for with 50 years of other people's dirty floors, connected to a business loan taken out in my name that I had never applied for. And a wire transfer. $99,000, the wedding deposit. I know you want to ask me how I felt in that moment. I know you are sitting wherever you are listening to this, and you need to know whether I cried or raged or simply fell apart at my own kitchen table. Here is the honest answer. I did the math. I sat with a legal pad in 2 columns. What I had given, what I had received, and I sat with those numbers for 4 hours without moving. The black-eyed peas burned on the stove, and I did not stand up to turn them off. The numbers didn't grieve. They were just numbers, cold and exact and final, and what I felt sitting there was not grief. Grief is for losses you didn't see coming. What I felt was the cold completion of a knowing I had been keeping at arm's length for years. I looked at the rotary phone on the wall. Raymond's phone. The phone through which she had delivered, for 3 years, every explanation and deflection and "Mom, you're imagining things," that kept the door of my suspicion from swinging all the way open. That phone had received 30 years of this family's conversations without judgment or opinion. It held all of it in its ordinary beige plastic. It had witnessed everything. Something settled into me that was not rage and was not grief. Something colder and more permanent than either of those things. The specific clarity of a person who has found their location on the map and is now deciding where to go. I knew where I was. The only question remaining was what I was going to do about it, and I was going to have to answer that question entirely on my own. No one was coming. I need you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it, with its full and uncomfortable weight, because accepting it as fact rather than temporary condition was the thing that changed me most fundamentally. When I finished laying out all the papers and understanding the full shape of what had happened, my first instinct was to reach outward. 75 years of instinct, a lifetime of belief that love builds reserves you can draw on in crisis. I picked up the phone. I made the calls. My pastor prayed with me over the phone and expressed concern about scandal, about what a public confrontation might mean for the community. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat for a moment with the precise meaning of his concern. That what had been done to me was less urgent than the discomfort of naming it out loud. My cousin Loretta in Baton Rouge cried and said it was a sin and a shame, and that somebody ought to do something. She asked me what I was planning. I said I wasn't sure yet. She said, "Let me know how it turns out." You know that feeling. I suspect you recognize it. When you finish making every call you believed might bring help, and you are still sitting in the same chair, alone, with the same problem. When the people you gave your life for respond to the worst thing that has happened to you with sympathy instead of strategy. It is a particular kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being without people. The loneliness of understanding that the debt of love you believed you had accumulated does not work the way you thought it did. That the ledger was never being kept on both sides. Nobody was coming to save me. And in that fact, strange as this sounds, there was a certain clarifying liberation. Once you know no rescue is on its way, you stop waiting and you start working. The legal aid clinic put me in touch with an attorney named David Fontenot, who had handled elder financial abuse cases for 22 years, and who listened to everything I told him without once speaking to me, as though being old meant being slow. He told me I had a case. He told me I needed documentation, original documents where I could obtain them, evidence of the unauthorized transactions, proof that what had occurred was not what I had consented to. I was a retired hospital intake coordinator. I had spent 40 years filing paperwork that other people's lives depended on. I knew the difference between a story and a case. The difference was evidence. And I had been too soft for too long, and now I was going to be something else entirely. That was the moment I became my own detective, my own advocate, my own ally. Because when I searched for someone else to fill that role, the search came up empty. And the case still needed to be built, and I was the only one who had been present for all of it. I retrieved 6 years of bank statements and printed them at the library. I photographed the original deed to my mother's house with my telephone. Every page, every seal, every notarized signature. I went to the storage unit Renee had organized on my behalf and spent an afternoon working through boxes. And at the bottom of the box labeled Mom's medical records, I found the jewelry sale receipts, the loan documents, and 2 pages bearing my name in a handwriting I did not recognize as mine. I photographed all of it. The anger I felt during those hours was not hot. I want to be precise about this because people imagine betrayal as something volcanic, something that erupts and burns. What I felt was cold, perfectly and precisely cold. My hands on the papers did not shake once that entire afternoon. I drove home. I made a timeline at my kitchen table. I made a list of witnesses. At the top of the list I had been building, I wrote one word: phone. You know what the worst part was? I was not truly surprised, not down where it counted. That is what nobody tells you about betrayal by someone you have loved for 40 years. The shock is not that it happened. The shock is that some part of you already knew and made the choice, over and over, to keep not knowing. Because knowing required action. Because action required the end of something you were not yet ready to let end. The day I was ready, I put on my reading glasses and started reading the fine print. 75 years old, just beginning. Here is the version of me that Renee encountered for the 4 months that followed. A tired old woman, slightly vague, grateful for her daughter's management of the complicated business of aging. Gently forgetful, easily reassured. When she called, this version of me was warm and quiet, asking soft questions about her honeymoon plans, expressing mild interest in the life she was building from my mother's savings. That was the performance. What she was actually calling was a rotary phone with a $22 digital recorder pressed against the back of the receiver, held in place by a rubber band the mailman had left on my doorstep. 8 hours of memory on that recorder. I charged it every evening on the kitchen counter. Every call Renee made to that phone, I recorded. Louisiana is a one-party consent state. I had confirmed this with Mr. Fontenot before buying the recorder. I had been a party to every call. All 41 recordings were admissible. The first time she said something that made my hand tighten on the receiver so hard I had to look at my own knuckles to remind myself not to react. She was describing an apartment in the Garden District she and her husband were considering. Nice neighborhood, she said. Higher end of their budget, but they had resources to draw on. She laughed that bright, careless laugh of hers. Resources to draw on. I said, that sounds lovely, baby. And I wrote the date and time in the small notebook beside the phone. She was careful in the early weeks. Renee has always been intelligent. I raised her to be intelligent, which means the skill set originated with me, a fact I had perhaps been insufficiently conscious of while I was busy making myself small to accommodate her. But people who are comfortable in their deception always relax eventually. The performance of the confused old mother gave her permission to relax faster than was wise. By week 6, Mom, I've been managing your finances for years. You've always trusted me with this. By week 9, the house is technically in both our names now. That's just how the paperwork worked out. Week 12, she made the mistake that changed everything. She kept talking after she believed I had already set the receiver down. She was speaking to a friend. She said, "The wedding was a business investment. My mother has no idea what she signed. She's old. She just wants things to feel normal." 41 recordings over 4 months. I kept the recorder in the lining of my Bible, because that was the one place in this house I was certain she would not go through without a conscience. My church fan watched from the windowsill every morning. Martin Luther King's face had taken on an expression I had started to interpret as specifically intended for me. And in those same 4 months, I did something I had not done in years. I cooked exactly what I wanted. No more lighter, no more not too heavy, no more adjusting the flavors in my own kitchen to accommodate someone else's preferences. I cooked red beans with andouille the way my mother made them, heavy with smoked meat and thyme and bay leaves, and the kind of patience that turns humble ingredients into something magnificent. I cooked bread pudding with whiskey sauce on a Tuesday with no occasion whatsoever. I cooked my black-eyed peas with a full-fat ham hock, slow and dark and deeply seasoned, and I ate them at my own table in my own time with nobody's voice in my ear telling me to watch the salt, I cannot tell you adequately what this did for me. It sounds like cooking. It was not merely cooking. Every meal I made alone in that kitchen was a declaration. I am still here. This kitchen is still mine. My appetite for food, for life, for my own choices, has not been signed over to anyone. The close call came in week 10. Renee let herself in on a Tuesday morning. She had a key, which I had not yet had the legal standing to change, and I heard the front door and had just enough time to push the recorder under the quilt on the kitchen table and fold the fabric over it before she appeared in the doorway. She looked at me. She looked at the quilt. I could see something moving behind her eyes. An assessment. A check confirming that her advantage was still intact. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Just the blanket," I said. "For the grandchild." She studied the quilt for a long moment. Then she smiled and asked if there was coffee. I made it. I smiled. I asked about her husband. I performed the tired, grateful, easily reassured old mother for 40 more minutes while the digital recorder sat beneath that quilt 3 feet away, holding her own voice in its memory. When she left, I sat still for 60 seconds. Then I reached under the quilt and checked the recorder. It hadn't been touched. Not yet, I thought. But soon. David Fontenot sat across from me at his desk, surrounded by manila folders, and told me matter-of-factly that I had assembled one of the most comprehensive intake evidence packages he had seen at this stage of a case. He said it as a professional assessment, not as a compliment. I received it the same way. I told him what I needed. The lien on my mother's house vacated completely. Every unauthorized financial transaction documented and tied to a specific action Renee had taken. The full $34,000 recovered. Her name removed from every document it did not lawfully belong on. And I needed it done in a way that left no ambiguity, not a quiet settlement, not a private arrangement where she got to call it a misunderstanding and walk away with her story intact. A misunderstanding is when you borrow $20 and forget to return it. What she did was a systematic, multi-year exploitation of a 75-year-old woman's love and trust and exhaustion, and the record needed to reflect exactly that. He told me the civil proceedings would take time. He told me the recordings, under Louisiana's one-party consent law, were among the strongest elements of the case. He advised me to continue documenting, to keep myself in the house, and to sign absolutely nothing new that came to me through Renee's direction. I kept all three. What I was preparing beyond the courtroom was something for my community. Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church holds its annual spring gathering in the Fellowship Hall. The third Saturday of May, 60-plus members from our block and the surrounding neighborhood, folding chairs, sweet tea on a side table, an open testimony portion where the floor is given to whoever needs it. 31 years I had attended that gathering. I had stood up during the testimony portion twice, once for Raymond, once for my mother. I knew the structure of that evening the way I know my own kitchen. When the testimony opened, how long the floor stayed open, where the speaker stood, which window let in the best late light. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and I prepared for it with the same attention I had applied to every important thing in my life. I made 63 copies of the key bank statements, the ones showing the $34,000 withdrawal and the wedding wire transfer. 1 copy for every seat. I borrowed a small speaker from Miss Eula, who, when I told her everything, took my hands in both of hers and said quietly, "I knew something was wrong. I should have pushed harder." I forgave her in the same breath. It was not her sin to carry. Do you understand what I was building toward? I think you do. I think you have been listening to this and feeling the momentum building the way you feel a storm approaching from inside a still house. That pressure in the air. That knowledge that something is about to break open. I thought about the Jaguar XJ in classic black that had taken up residence in my imagination during those months. I want to be clear about what that image meant to me. Not wealth, not status, not the business of acquiring expensive things. It was an image of freedom, a car that belongs to a woman who answers to no one, who sets her own direction and drives toward it without checking whether it is convenient for anyone else. I had a 2009 Civic that ran without complaint, but I held the Jaguar in my mind as a compass point, a reminder of the woman I was in the process of becoming, a woman who had paid every bill in this household, in every possible sense, for 42 years, and was reclaiming the right to her own velocity and her own road. Renee called twice in the week before the gathering. The second call, she mentioned some additional paperwork about the house she needed me to review. I said in my warmest and most tired-sounding voice, "Of course, baby. You know I trust you." I did not trust her. There was not a molecule of trust remaining in me for that woman. But she didn't know that yet, and the distance between what she believed and what was actually true was the most valuable asset I possessed. The night before the gathering, I laid out my dress. I polished my shoes. I put fresh batteries in Miss Eula's speaker. I set the folder of 63 bank statement copies on my kitchen table beside my Bible and my church fan. I looked at Raymond's phone on the wall, this phone that had received and recorded more truth than it was ever built to carry, and I thought, "You have done your part. Now it is mine to do." I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept without difficulty for the first time in 8 months. The fellowship hall of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church smells like old wood and good coffee, and a faith that has weathered a great deal without becoming brittle. The floor is linoleum, buffed clean by the same volunteer crew every Thursday. The windows are narrow and set high, and in May at 5 o'clock the evening light comes through them in long, specific columns that fall across the folding chairs and the floor, and whoever happens to be standing at the front of the room. I arrived 20 minutes early. I took a seat in the front row, which I never do. I placed my folder on my lap, the speaker on the chair to my right, my church fan on top of the speaker. I sat with my hands folded and my back straight, and I waited. You might want to know how I felt in those 20 minutes. I will tell you honestly. I was not afraid. What I felt was weight, the weight of what was about to be said aloud in front of witnesses for the first time. Fear is about what might happen. Weight is about what already has, and the cost of having carried it so long, and the deep relief of being finally allowed to set it down. Renee arrived at 6:15 with her husband Marcus, tall, expensive shirt, the particular easy confidence of a person who has never had to account for anything. She didn't see me immediately. When she did, she gave me the managed social smile, the same one she wore when she called me difficult in this very building, and steered Marcus towards seats on the far side of the room with practiced ease. I did not return the smile. When Pastor Williams opened the testimony portion, I stood immediately. The room went quiet in that particular way, not the polite quiet of someone beginning to speak, but the other kind. 63 people registering simultaneously that something is about to occur outside the normal order of a Tuesday evening gathering. I said, "My name is Claudette Boudreau. Most of you know me. I need to tell this community something, and I need you to hear it from me directly, because you deserve that honesty, and so do I." I told them what had happened. Plainly, without theater, without the kind of dramatic delivery that might have allowed people to feel they were watching a performance rather than witnessing a fact. The medical power of attorney, the waiting room and the small print and the missing glasses, the $34,000, the lien on my mother's house, the jewelry that had come down through 4 generations of women in my family, the wire transfer to the wedding venue. I named every figure. I passed the folders down every row. 63 people reading 63 copies of the same bank statements. The room had a sound to it then, paper and breath, and the specific weight of a truth arriving in the people it was always going to reach eventually. From across the room, Renee's voice. "Mom." I pressed play. Her own voice came out of the speaker, bright and careless and warm with the certainty of someone who believes they are untouchable. "My mother has no idea what she signed. She's old. She just wants things to feel normal." Pastor Williams's sweet tea sat untouched on the table beside him. I played the second recording. Her voice again, from a November call. "The house is technically in both our names now, Mom. That's just how the paperwork worked out." And then my own voice, the performing voice, the voice I had used for 4 months while building this case. That sounds nice, baby." Hearing my own voice in that room hit me somewhere specific. It landed like grief, not for myself exactly, but for the woman in that recording who was still playing the role she'd been given, still patient, still doing invisible work while being underestimated. I kept my face still. My hands stayed folded. I set the speaker down. I looked at my daughter across those rows of folding chairs. I said, "I spent 42 years building what I believed was a debt of love. I believed my sacrifices were an investment. I believed that what I gave would be honored when I needed it most. I was wrong about the terms, but I was not wrong about what I am owed." Then I said the thing I had written and rewritten 17 times over 3 weeks. "You thought the woman who paid the deposit had forgotten what she signed. You forgot that the woman who taught you to write your own name was still in the room." Not a sound. Marcus put his hand on Renee's arm. She shook it off. Her face had gone a color I had never seen on it before. Not anger, not the performative frustration I had watched her deploy for years. Something rawer than both of those things. The specific horror of a person who has just understood, completely and with no available exit, the full scope of what they underestimated. Pastor Williams said very quietly, "Sister Boudreau, is there anything this community can do for you?" I said, "I already have what I need. I just needed the people in this room to know the truth." Because truth told out loud in front of witnesses is the only kind that doesn't get quietly revised later. I sat down. I smoothed my dress. I put my church fan in my lap, and I looked at Martin Luther King's face looking back at me with all the quiet authority of a man who had stood in harder rooms than this one and told harder truths and refused, absolutely without performance, without compromise, to be reduced. Dignity does not negotiate. I had remembered that. Finally, completely, without apology or permission, I had remembered that. The civil suit was filed on a Monday in April. Mr. Fontenot submitted 41 audio recordings, 67 pages of financial documentation, the original deed photographs, the altered paperwork, and the handwritten ledger I had been maintaining since 2018. The lien on my mother's house was vacated within 30 days on the basis of fraudulent documentation. Renee's name was removed from every account it had never lawfully belonged on. A court order was issued requiring monthly restitution payments toward the full $34,000 in misappropriated inheritance funds. Every dollar of my mother's wealth, ordered returned with interest, in the precise language of the law. I want to tell you how I felt when Mr. Fontenot called me with that news. You might expect triumph, the hot, electric satisfaction that stories are supposed to produce when justice arrives at last. What I actually felt was stillness. A deep, complete, unperturbed stillness, like the particular quiet that arrives when a sound that has been present for so long you stopped registering it as sound finally, entirely, ceases. Renee called once after the hearing. She called Raymond's phone. I stood in my kitchen and watched it ring, and I did not pick up the receiver. I stood in front of that phone afterward for a long time. I thought of Raymond mounting it on a Saturday in 1991 with his tongue pressed to his teeth, being precise. I thought of all the calls that had come through it. My mother's death, my grandchildren's births, Raymond's diagnosis, 42 years of my daughter's voice in all its registers, warm and managing and careless, and, for 4 months, secretly recorded. This phone had absorbed the worst of what happened in this kitchen and held it without comment and given it back to me when I needed it. I stood in front of it and let all of it mean something it had not been allowed to mean while I was still in the middle of surviving. Then I went to the kitchen table and I picked up the quilt. Renee's grandchild's quilt, red and yellow and deep navy blue, with my mother's border pattern. I looked at it for a while. I thought about what it meant now. I thought about whether to finish it. I finished it. Not for Renee. For the grandchild who hadn't been born yet and had committed no wrong. And because I am someone who finishes what she starts. That has been true of me from the beginning, and it is true of me still. And I refuse to allow what my daughter did to revise even that small permanence. The Senior Resource Center is 3 miles from my house, on a street where old oak trees make a tunnel of shade over the sidewalk in the afternoon. I go on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I sit with older women, tired women, women who have signed documents without their glasses, women who believe in reciprocity the way I once did, and have begun to notice the unsettling arithmetic of how little finds its way back to them. I help them read what they are being asked to sign before they sign it. I explain the difference between medical authority and financial authority, and why that difference can mean everything. The difference between a house you own and a lien you never knew was coming. The difference between an inheritance protected and an inheritance spent on someone else's wedding. I am not performing strength for these women. I am offering it, genuinely, from a place where it lives on its own engine now. Before, my strength was devotional, poured outward, requiring the belief that it would be returned to sustain itself. Now it runs because it runs. It does not need anything back. Miss Eula comes with me on Thursdays. She made up for not pushing harder years ago by pushing very hard now, in our neighbors' kitchens and at church suppers, and wherever older women have questions about documents they don't fully understand. She makes the coffee. I bring the paperwork. It is an excellent arrangement, and we are, the two of us, a formidable pair. I have been saving, steadily, the way my mother saved, with intention and patience and a destination held clearly in mind. I have found the warm climate I am heading toward. Somewhere the light comes in sideways and generous. Somewhere the winters do not exist in the way my bones have learned to dread them. Somewhere that will belong entirely and unambiguously to me. I am not there yet. But I know the address. I know the direction. And sometimes in the evenings, when my kitchen is quiet and my supper is exactly what I want, which is sometimes just bread pudding eaten at 10 o'clock standing at the counter with no occasion and no apology, I allow myself the Jaguar XJ in classic black. I allow myself to drive it down an open road in that warm climate with the windows down, answering to no one, arriving somewhere that is mine by every possible measure. I am 75 years old. I have been through something that would have ended a less stubborn woman, and I intend to drive toward what comes next in the manner of someone who has paid for the road and intends to enjoy every mile of what remains. It is summer now, and New Orleans in summer has that particular quality, thick and golden and warm, every surface slightly alive with heat even in the shade, the crepe myrtles out in their fuchsia on every block, the children on our street near the elevated train running with the full freedom that only the long months give them. My kitchen windows are open. The ceiling fan turns its slow, deliberate circle above the table. I am sitting here with a glass of sweet tea, and the particular peace of a woman who has settled what needed settling, and is no longer waiting for anything to arrive. The restitution payments have come on time for 6 consecutive months. My mother's fortune, returning in pieces, like a long conversation resuming after an interruption I did not choose and did not deserve. Renee has not called since the single ring I did not answer. Her husband sent an email through his attorney's office suggesting a conversation. I did not respond. This is not cruelty, and it is not punishment. It is a boundary drawn by a woman who has learned, at 75 and not a moment too soon, that access to a person is a privilege. And when you have demonstrated what you do with that privilege, you forfeit it without appeal. The house is mine. Unambiguously, entirely, without encumbrance of any kind. My mother's deed, my mother's 50 years of careful living, my name alone on every document. The chain-link fence needs a coat of paint, and I will get to it on the morning I choose, in my own time, which is the only time that counts in this house now. I want to speak to you directly, not as someone finishing a story, but as someone who survived one. Because this is the part where the story becomes a warning, and warnings are the most important thing I know how to offer. What happened to me has a pattern. It has recognizable stages and specific warning signs that are present and visible before the crisis arrives, before you are on your kitchen floor at 11 o'clock at night, while strangers write down the time. The pattern begins with access. It always begins with access. Someone you love asks to help manage something, a billing matter, an administrative complexity, something you are tired and they are capable, and doesn't it just make sense for them to handle it? The reason sounds like love. It often is love, or it began as love, which is what makes the pattern so profoundly difficult to name in its early stages. You give a little access, then a little more. Each time the reason sounds like love. Each time you give it because you believe in the account you have been building together all these years. The inheritance of trust that should protect you when you need it most. And then one day, you are in a waiting room without your glasses, and a pen is placed in your hand by the person you trust more than anyone on earth, and you sign. Watch for the person who steers you away from your own documents. Watch for the person who handles things without explanation and grows impatient when you ask for one. Watch for the person who calls you difficult in front of others, even lightly, even laughing, even in a church hallway at a gathering where people you love are watching, because that is not a personality observation. That is a strategy. That is a person building a public narrative about your credibility in rooms where your reputation will matter when the truth finally needs defending. Experts warn that false incapacity declarations allow the guardian to control accounts and restrict visitors, and that is exactly how financial exploitation of older people scales. Not through force, but through paperwork. Not through enemies, but through the people closest to you who know precisely where your trust is kept and how to use it. It begins not with cruelty. It begins with helpfulness. That is the most important sentence I know how to give you. It begins with helpfulness, and you will not see it coming unless you know to look. And here is what I need you to know about how alone you are not in this. Research reveals that only 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse is ever reported. 1 in 24. Millions of older people sitting at kitchen tables with legal pads, doing the math alone in the quiet, believing they are uniquely foolish or uniquely responsible for what was done to them, too ashamed of their own trust to speak. You are not uniquely anything. You are one of many, and the many deserve to know there is a way through. Tell someone. Call the legal aid clinic. Call the senior advocacy office. Let someone like Ms. Thoreau sit across from you with a notepad and ask the direct questions. The law in most states is on your side in ways you may not yet know. Your documents belong to you. Your house belongs to you. Your name on a piece of paper belongs to you. No one can remove those things without your fully informed consent. And if they have, there are lawyers and social workers and women in resource centers on streets lined with old oak trees who will sit with you and show you, patiently and without condescension, how to take them back. I am one of those women now. That is my inheritance. Not only the $34,000 the courts ordered returned, though I am grateful for every cent of it. My inheritance is this. having gone through something, knowing exactly how it was done, and being willing to say it clearly in rooms full of people who need to hear it. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something. I want to know where you are right now, what city, what table, what time of day it is for you, and I want to know what you would have done. When those 11 words came through a phone you trusted, when the person you had given your whole life to told you that you didn't fit the aesthetic of the celebration built on your own money, would you have pressed record? Would you have stood up in the fellowship hall? Would you have passed the folders down the rows? Tell me in the comments. Your answer is part of this story too, and I want to read every single one. Share this with someone who needs the warning, someone who is smiling at a joke that is not a joke, someone who is signing things in waiting rooms without their glasses, someone who is still waiting for all the love they poured out to find its way back to them. They need this story before they need to tell their own version of it. If this reached something in you, if any part of what I said felt like a truth you have been carrying alone without a name for it, like this video and keep it close. Subscribe, because I have more stories to tell. Stories about women who counted everything they had given and decided, at whatever age they were when they were ready, to stop giving it away for free. My name is Claudette Boudreau. I am 75 years old. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, in a modest ranch house with a chain-link fence and a small yard that my mother left to me, and it is mine. The deed, the title, the name on every document, the chain-link fence, and everything inside it and everything I am becoming inside it. The rotary phone is still on my wall, and so, finally, completely and entirely on my own terms, am I.